Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's Open News meeting. My name is Matt Dancona. I'm an editor at Tortoise. It's a delight to have you all here. And thank you for joining and thank you for taking part in what I'm sure is a busy social day for all of you. Let me just explain to those of you who haven't been to one of these Open News meetings before what they are. I'm sure many of you do know, but those who don't. The Open News meeting is really, I suppose, the purest expression of the Tortoise ethos, which is it's where we discuss things that are on our minds, but more importantly, we want to hear from you about what you think about the issues, both of the day, but hopefully more strategically, more longer term. It's very difficult at the moment, of course, because we're in the middle of a single crisis that's impinging upon us in all sorts of ways. But one of our objectives in these meetings has been to try and look at it in a broader way and look at the underlying forces. If you haven't been to a ThinkIn before, and I'm sure in this digital format, and I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have, then forgive me. Just let me explain how it works. Essentially, what I want to do is hear from as many of you as possible. And there are a couple of main themes I'd like to address, more of them in a second. But just to go through a bit of housekeeping, for those that haven't been before, if you look on your screen, you'll see there's a participants icon. If you click on that, that will lead you to a box which has a raise hand option. And can I just see that you're all able to do it? If you could click on raise hand now, I can see I've got some real, great. So clearly we have some serious professionals in the house. If you can click on the raise hand icon, that would be great, just to let me know that you're all participating, because as I said, the purpose of the whole exercise is to harvest your thoughts and hear what you're thinking about. So let's get down straight away to business. Interestingly, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has just done a quite serious statement, update on the economic policy that the government has on COVID-19 and how to reignite the economy, keep it going, avoid a cliff edge. If you have thoughts during this Open News meeting, do please add into the chat. Ellie Jacobs, my wonderful colleague, will be monitoring the chat, and you can see on your screens that you can just type into that anything you want, and I will keep an eye on that. And if there are interesting things that you have to say, I might just zoom in on you. But the best way is if you can raise your hand if you have something you want to contribute. Just let me know. As I said, the measure of success of these events is what you say rather than what I say. So please do chip in as you can on anything that's related to the subject we're talking about. And the purpose, as I say, is to invest our journalism with as much member participation as possible. Particularly at a time like this where people are feeling that their voices are unheard, it's more important than ever that we turn to our members in a transparent spirit and, get them to add into what we are thinking and the ideas that we're germinating. Now, to that end, you may have seen in the app that we have a new system called the news list, which gives you some idea of some of the subjects that are particularly animating us at the moment. And one of those is the whole performance of Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and I want to come to that in the second part of the ThinkIn. But just as a starter for 10, given that the last few days have been so dominated by the first phase of a partial relaxation of the lockdown, if that's the word, and some very, very confused messages and a great deal of public confusion over what exactly they're being expected to do and when. But on the other hand, an appeal by the government to common sense and an appeal by the government to the public's patience to understand that we're moving from a very simple stage of the lockdown, which is stay at home, a very clear message that's easy to understand, to a transitional phase that may be quite prolonged and protracted, where people are going to have to take more decisions themselves, where we're recovering a degree of agency, and therefore the decisions, the sloganing, the messaging is more nuanced. So I suppose, just as a way of kicking things off, let's conduct a straw poll using the raised hand mechanism. Could you, if you think that the government's new slogan, "Stay alert," is reasonably clear, please raise your hand. If you think "Stay alert" is clear, put your hand up. If not, don't. So we've got not a huge number of takers for that. Some would call it, so just to reiterate, if you think "Stay alert" is a clear or relatively clear slogan, raise hand now. Well, I have to say that is a pretty bad result for the government, because I can only identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 people who think that it is. Okay, well, that's a fairly clear thumbs down, and that probably suggests that my second question will have a similar response, which is, when the government says that people should use their common sense, do you think that's sensible? If you think it's sensible to make whatever common sense means the test of behaviour, do you think the government's behaving well? So if you think they are behaving sensibly in using common sense as the criterion, put your hand up now. So hands up now if common sense is a good way of going about getting out of a pandemic. And again, we have relatively few people saying that it is a good messaging. So I am reasonably sure that the meeting is not wildly enthusiastic about what it's seen and heard over the last few days. Please lower hands now. Do let me know now why you think that it is as shambolic as you clearly do. Do put your hand up if you'd like to chip in, because Suze Wilson has a hand up. Suze, can we come to you? Sorry, Suze, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm actually in Scotland, and I work for a UK company. So,
and you haven't moved. You haven't dropped stay at home in Scotland. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. We haven't dropped stay at home. And because I work for a UK company, in fact, a UK construction company, I'm very interested in how they're approaching things from the point of view of Scotland, and in terms of the way we're moving in England. And the issue for me is that, as you've already said, the message for lockdown is incredibly simple. As soon as you give people any sort of wriggle room with any element of interpretation, discretion, common sense, it's just not prescriptive enough. We're in a pandemic. We need, in my view, much more prescriptive and clear messaging from the government. And it's a huge frustration that we have this muddle which is occurring. And if you follow any social media, I mean, last night it was incredible the amount of the government is coming in for so much criticism, because people are saying things like, so I can go to the garden centre on my bike and I can see my parents there, but I can't actually go and visit them in their front garden. There are all sorts of ridiculous situations. So I don't think the messaging is clear enough. I think it's allowing far too much wriggle room for people, and I think we will come a cropper as a result. And sadly, because the government has given us that discretion, and we all know that the Prime Minister is a huge liberalist, you know, it completely flies in the face of his whole philosophy that we should be so prescriptive. However, we're in a pandemic, and I look to places like New Zealand, I look to places like Taiwan, I look to places where they've been able to put much more prescriptive measures in place. And it seems to me that they will have a happier outcome than we will have. Or at least pardon?
Do you think there will come I mean, clearly, unless we all stay in lockdown forever, that there has to come a time when things are less prescriptive. So, notwithstanding the fact that the messaging was a bit of a shambles, are you really saying that this is happening too early? Because obviously there would come a time when we would presumably have a less prescriptive regime.
So I struggle a little bit. I don't necessarily think it's too soon. What I would say is I probably prefer the way that the Nicola Sturgeon is approaching it. I think what none of us probably have access, or I certainly don't have access to, is all the medical advice and all the science that's going along with it. I think that there's a perception that the science is very clear, and of course it isn't. And there isn't that much evidence, and yet we're having to make very life-changing decisions about it. So I struggle with that. I tell you what, I wish the government was more upfront about. The fact that the measures that they published in that 50-page document yesterday are a muddle, because they're still trying to pretend that their overall strategy is about health. And if I didn't have to hold my iPad up, I would be saying they've got health versus economy. They've got that invidious equation the entire time. And it's incredibly unpalatable for the government to come out and say that they're now stopping, or they're making priority less, they're making health less of a priority, and they're now thinking about the economy. But of course, if you read through the 50-page document yesterday, of course they're having to prioritize the economy because it's on its knees, but it's still seen as a very unpalatable message to say that you're prioritizing economy over health. But the reality is that we have to do that all the time, and we have to make decisions of health versus economy all the time. And in a way, I think it's a bit disingenuous. I wish they were a bit more upfront about it, but of course, I suppose what they're trying to avoid is any headline that says, government has now reached a stage where it's palatable for more people to be put at risk, because what we're trying to do is save our economy. But what we're not looking at is our long-term future. I think the impact on our economy is going to be massive for years.
I think that's interesting, Susan, although I think that a lot of conservatives and business people would say that they wish that the government was prioritising the economy more. At any rate, I see John Alexander has had his hand up for a while. John, can we come to you? John, hi.
Yeah, so I wanted to chip in. My take really is that this is much more a kind of political moment than a public health moment. That it's actually the government was kind of coming to the end of a path and had to do something to try and reframe the situation. So so in my work, I work from around a thing called the New Citizenship Project, and my work is based in sort of an analysis that argues that there's three competing stories going on at the moment. There's a subject story, which is all about kind of government as hero, tell people what to do, and people kind of do what you're told. There's a consumer story, which is kind of government step back and people use your own discretion, do what you think. And then there's potentially a kind of what we call a citizen story, what I call a citizen story. It's like, let's figure this out together. Let's work out how we can come out of this stronger and better. Let's take on the challenges together. And I think that the really smart thing that the thing that they've done is the subject story is running out of road for us. We're coming under huge pressure. Like the idea that we're the kind of saving heroes is starting to fly out the window with failure and everything.
That's really interesting, John. Can you elaborate a little bit about what you mean by a citizen solution? Because I think a lot of people would be puzzled by what that meant in granular practice, and I would also assume that achieving that end would take quite a while.
I don't think it would. I think so. I would argue actually slightly contrary to what Susan was saying, that some of what that actually the citizen solution is largely what the Taiwanese have been doing as well. So I've been playing with this a bit. So I wrote a piece on this on Sunday. I'm just a I've never written for anything, but my blog kind of went viral. It's had 500,000 views as we speak. But and I'm not. I just want just to say that this is sort of latching something. What I'm trying to do now is sort of back that up with what do I really mean, which is your question. So what I've got to so far is that you might say there kind of be three principles at the heart of a citizen approach, which would be fundamentally different to what they're doing. The first would be transparency, not secrecy. So you'd be trying to make sure that everyone had useful, meaningful access to data that genuinely helped them make the right decisions. Because at the moment, the situation I would argue is that all of the responsibility has been devolved to the individual from government, but without the information that they need to make the right decisions. So transparency, not secrecy, and you could mine that forever. The second one is participation, not centralization. So at the moment, like in a kind of consumer story, government provides the service that will save us, and so centralization, tracking app, all the sort of attempt to kind of withdraw power and withdraw funding even from local government is a massive part of that. Versus the Taiwanese thing of like, let's open the challenges up. There's a thing called face mask map where they've like techies have kind of hacked and built, and there's like 25 different things that they've built at this community. The Scottish government sort of opened consultation, the RSA proposal. So there's loads that you can put into that category. And then the last one for me is learning, not selling. Like I think I've seen in a couple of the comments people talking about this government's has always been good at messaging. They're still good at messaging. This is super deliberate in my view, and they're selling something that will enable them to keep power rather than kind of actually opening a conversation and learning and trying to figure out with us how we work in a kind of in a coronavirus world. So those would be my three things, like transparency, not secrecy, participation, not centralization, and learning, not secrecy, learning, not selling.
Just to come back one last time, John, are you, as I understand it, you're saying that there is a lot of grassroots capacity out there that could be harnessed were it not for the centralization and the, if you like, the Whitehall-centric way in which policy is conducted.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
That's correct. Okay. I mean, you look at from the techie side, you look at the coronavirus tech handbook, there's like thousands of techies building apps and trying to do stuff, but not being tapped into. There's exactly the same equivalent community as in Taiwan. They've got this GovZero movement. But also you look at mutual aid groups and how quickly like people want to do stuff. And the NHS Responder app being...
Sorry to interrupt. Is that the handbook that's been generated by Newspeak House?
Yeah, that's Ed Superior's thing.
Yes, no, it's a very interesting resource. I recommend it to anyone. And if Ellie could get that up in the chat room, that would be great, a link to the Newspeak House coronavirus handbook. Joseph Higgins has had his hand up for a while. Could we go to Joseph?
Yes.
Joseph, hi.
Hi, thank you for having me. The principles that John just laid out, I think we probably sort of all agree with, that those would be sort of good things to have to make sure that the communication and the policy that comes through is more effective. But I'm just wondering whether or not all of the sort of ambiguities and controversies over the strategy would have been avoided if Parliament had been the institution that would have been the vehicle for those principles to be enacted. So around sort of Wednesday, Thursday, when we knew that an announcement was coming, that to be in Parliament rather than this one tender hooks through the sort of bank holiday weekend and newspaper headlines to fill that space.
And do you think that reflects an imbalance in the way in which the government is approaching this almost as a media campaign rather than as a public policy crisis?
Yeah, certainly. And I'd say that it shouldn't necessarily like come as a surprise that the approach they're taken is like as such of not necessarily working kind of through or with Parliament with this. As we all know, the sort of track record of Boris Johnson not appearing before the liaison committee, the prorogation crisis, and so on and so forth. But I think it would go quite a long way to have potentially avoided much of the sort of muddle that's arisen from the latest change of advice. Because the guidance, when you look through it, like, you can just about sort of make sense of it if you read it, of course. But if we have sort of a forum within the House of Commons, sort of the government making a more effective use of it, then that would probably, or at least help produce better policy outcomes, rather than sort of what we're seeing at the moment anyway, or at least the impression of that being the case.
And do you think that it's possible to move from one model to another in the process of a crime? I mean, this is the difficulty in all of this, is that some fantastic solutions are being proposed, but the private response from within Whitehall is that these are all great ideas, but it's very difficult to turn the tanker of government, you know, in the middle of a sea storm, to not to overstretch the metaphor.
I wouldn't say it's as big an obstacle as they would probably say it is, because the mechanisms are like all there, through kind of urgent questions, through ministerial questions, through committees, all those kind of things where the minutiae of policy details can be interrogated thoroughly. I mean, it's essentially sort of the message that the opposition is kind of putting across of, you know, we want to kind of engage in a national consensus, which is where what previous commentator Suze was talking about, of this discrepancy that we now have amongst the devolved administrations, could also have been avoided had the kind of voice of them being expressed through Parliament, but also by engaging with the devolved administrations as a sort of parallel to that.
That's great. Thank you very much. If anyone is interested in the Coronavirus Tech Handbook, which is full of fascinating links and ideas, it's in the chat. There's a link posted by John Alexander, so do click on that if you're interested. Thoroughly recommend it. I'd like to, if he's willing to chat, come to one of our ThinkIn regulars, Martin Richt, who I think has had who's been saying some very interesting things in the chat about the strategy. Martin, hi, how are you?
I'm well, how are you? I think I'm maybe just a bit more cynical about some of the motives in this sense. I feel like the government have probably been deliberately ambiguous about how we should be acting during lockdown. I think we've seen measures that are a little half in, half out, in the sense of we haven't gone full lockdown. I've discussed this a lot with friends. You know, we look at places like Spain where children weren't allowed to exercise, they weren't allowed outdoors until last week. We haven't had measures anything like that yet. I think a lot of people feel that all of their liberties have been taken away, and there's actually this misunderstanding, I think, generally about how severe the government have been. I don't think they have, but obviously there have been these measures that have been put in place, and that's deliberate in my sense. I think that's deliberate because it gives them wiggle room. It allows some level of blame shifting when we come out of this. So I know we didn't do all of the stuff you said we did. So the economy and the state of the economy is not all our fault. We tried to allow some of you still to go to work, etc. But at the same time, the death toll, we told you not to be more than 2 meters apart, so on and so forth. I think there is a deliberate approach to this from the government.
So essentially, you're taking the stay at home, which is a top-down, not authoritarian, but I mean, it's clearly a statist governmentalist approach. And the government is now withdrawing its moral agency and devolving that onto the citizenry with a view to the blame game to come. Would that be a fair summation of what you're saying, Martin?
It wasn't just stay at home, though, was it? It wasn't like in France, where you had to have paperwork if you wanted to leave the house, or Spain, where it was you are not allowed out if you are within a certain age bracket, or you can only go to the shop. You're allowed out if you want to go to the park. You're allowed out to go for a run. You're allowed out to go to the shops. I mean, I could legitimately leave the house several times a day if I wanted. It wasn't stay at home like we are suggesting.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin. I'd like to come to our co-founder, James Harding, now. James, if I can. Hi, James.
Hey there, Matt. How are you doing?
Good.
I guess I wanted to pick up on a bit where Martin left off, and a bit what John was saying about citizens' responses. So the thing that I'm struggling with, and I think that we at Tortoise are struggling with a bit, is it's obviously not an either or. You're obviously not dealing with either a health crisis or an economic catastrophe. You're obviously dealing with both. And the idea that people start having these sort of discussions, which is we have to first deal with health and then we can deal with the economy, is obviously, ridiculously simplistic. I was looking this morning, when you wake up, I always look at what the headlines in all the papers are, and they're all telling you, if you like, the kind of information that's useful to a day trader, right? This is what's happened today. Here's the latest, here's the latest little piece of information. But at the same time, we knew yesterday that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to come out and provide government support for what's in effect a quarter of the workforce. The latest numbers are whatever it was, 6.3 million people. It'll probably get towards 8 million people. I find myself stopping and thinking, journalistically, how do we take this apart? There's an element here which is who are the people who are making these decisions and what motivates them? So if you think about it, it's an amazing thing. We have a chancellor at the height of the most difficult economic crisis, certainly since World War II. And of course, he didn't run as chancellor in the election. We know very little about his economics or economic thinking, and nor does anybody else in Whitehall. I don't think that's our problem. So I take Martin's point completely, that I think they're deliberately ambiguous because a lot of people don't yet know what they think, right? And when you're talking about the scale of government intervention, that's one of the reasons. So there's a whole who question. Who is Rishi Sunak? Who are the team around him? How are they making decisions? Because there is effectively a very profound debate here between the market purists who say the fastest way to recover is to allow failing businesses to go to the wall, right? And they are part of the sort of moral hazard gang that says we sustain those businesses and we are going to actually cause a longer, slower recession. And those people who say if you allow businesses to go to the wall and you allow jobs to go, you're going to see a longer and deeper scarring of the economy, and the demand side shock will be matched by a supply side shock. You'll lose the businesses that can actually get you out of this and the employed individuals who can actually help consume products. And I feel like we need to get under the bonnet of what's happening there. And if you think about it, if you look at the way journalism's working at the moment, we're all, we're very much Anthony Fauci this, or Valence that, or Whitty the other, or Matt Hancock. And a lot of it is inside Westminster, inside policy making. But I really worry about we in journalism doing what's often happened in a crisis, which is we train our sights on the acute problems, the ones that are the most noise, but we lose sight of the big chronic ones. And when you've got that scale of people on state support, you're looking at a chronic problem, and we don't yet really understand who are the people who are making decisions about it and what their thinking is. So I raise this because I think that for us, if you think about building Tortoise files, what Chris Cook has done with the Corona tracker feels to me like a really good step in the right direction, a really granular look at how the economy is changing and spending is changing. We now need to have something that's equivalent, I think, inside on the economy, right? So the equivalent to the scrutiny that's happening on the health side, that's happening on the economic side.
James, just while I've got you, I mean, it is interesting. I was surprised just listening to Sunak's statement before coming on this meeting that he seems to have, as far as I can work out, and I agree with you, it's very opaque, getting into the sort of Sunak camp and finding out what the mindset is. But, there was a clear sense about a week ago that he was going to taper down the furloughing scheme quite considerably more than he has.
Yeah.
Now he's talking about, funding 80% up to 2,500 up until October, which is a huge step forward in terms of state intervention, debt accumulation. It may well be that it helps to it helps to save businesses. It helps to keep people in the labour market. But what does it tell you about, what, if anything, does it tell you about Sunak? I mean, is he a less strong figure than we thought, or have we misread him and his ideology?
I don't know, but for example, John, I see John's writing in the chat, he's an ex-investment banker. The whole Johnson gig is driven by what will sell them. I don't think that's right at all. And I also don't think that necessarily helps you in trying to understand what's going on here, because the issue that we're looking at is a bunch of people came in on the back of a let's get Brexit done agenda, right? And you've talked a lot, Matt, about them coming in with a sort of campaign mentality. Right?
Yeah.
And that's absolutely right. But if you think about Brexit, and if you go back and you read Don Cummings's blog posts, the thing that's really striking about it is that Brexit was not an end in itself. It was a way of liberating the animal spirits, free, getting rid of the bureaucratic shackles of government.
So Tangerine changed. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a kind of a trading, enterprising economy. So you have this community that came into government with that agenda, and now they're making the biggest public sector bets that any of us have ever seen. And I don't think that, I have a strong view that you need to be seeing much more of the Chancellor, that there needs to be teams of people who are convened, who are focused on what the business response is, how you're handling things for employers and employees, what the infrastructure response should be. I mean, there's a whole kind of gearing up that seems to need to come out of number 11. But I think the really interesting thing is, to respond to your point, John, is that these guys are finding themselves in the job having been handed a set of problems that they never conceived of, and that their worldview they know is not fit to answer. So who then do they reach for? Who are the people who are going to help them think this through? Because as Matt says, what you heard out of number 11 a week ago was we're going to go for tapering, right? That's much more classic, market economists, let's winnow away, state support. Now they're closer to the things that Andrew Yang in the States was saying, which was, let's imagine a world where state support continues for as long as it's needed. And that might be as long as, summer, autumn next year, when a vaccine is widely available. These are massive changes in mentality. And I just think we've got to figure out a way that we get at that story with a kind of, that we're forensic on the one hand on the thinking, and we're urgent in understanding the nature of its consequences.
Thank you very much, James. I think Helena wanted to come in. Helena, are you there?
Hello.
Hi, Helena. Welcome.
I really wanted to pick up on James's point there about taking a more long-term approach in terms of economic reporting. And I know that we've kind of discussed it at these think-ins in the past, but I just don't think that there's been enough emphasis on not necessarily who is benefiting from this and who is going to benefit from this economically, but the sort of underlying structural economic differences that this is accelerating and pointing out. So for instance, I remember, Matt, a few weeks ago, we were talking about how low interest rates post this are going to continue to allow those who have credit and capital right now to buy houses, etc., while still disenfranchising those who can't. And for instance, where I live, in fact, on my cycle earlier today, I passed a whole new set of houses that are being built that I know people in my area are not going to be able to purchase by and large. And I'm thinking, who will be able to in the long term? And yeah, I just think that for all the talk that we've had, there's so much short-termism in economic headlines. And James, you mentioned this, you read the headlines now and it's like a daily traders report. And I just think it's almost tokenistic to focus on the fact that Halfords shares have gone up because people are buying bikes, and these shares have gone down. And I really would like to see some more long-term structural reporting on the economy as to, firstly, what this is pointing out that is problematic and has been problematic for a very long time, and why the Jacob Rees-Moggs of the world are continuing to profit and benefit from this. And secondly, how we can resolve those problems going forward.
Elena, it's interesting you say that, because there's been a lot of talk recently about how supply lines are organised and how we need to move away from just-in-time supply lines. And I wonder, listening to you, making a very interesting point, whether we need to also move away from just-in-time politics and just-in-time media interrogation, because you know, a lot of the problems of the last few weeks have been that there's a desire to feed the media beast, as James said, to produce the daily headlines. The press conferences have been fairly uninspiring in that regard, in that it mostly consisted of political correspondents saying, "Are we there yet?" Whereas, in fact, what you're suggesting, I think, if I understand it, is an opening up of the debate and a much more generous-spirited and strategic, and yet also forensic approach to where this leads in the medium to long term. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, sort of underline the structural basis of this, why we are in this position economically in the first place, like you were mentioning there about just-in-time supply chains and just-in-time politics. This hasn't come out of nowhere. We weren't well prepared to deal with this in the first place.
No, absolutely not. Thank you, Helena. On the question of Rishi Sunak, today has been mostly about the furloughing scheme, but we're also very interested, as you can see on our news list on the app, in the really quite striking failure so far of the government to get its business loans out of the door. And if there's anyone in the ThinkIn who's had any experience of that, of seeking a business loan during this crisis, or knows anything about it or has views, I'd be very interested to hear about that, because I think it's the furloughing naturally attracts most of the day-to-day coverage, because it affects individuals and it's very new and it's a word that we weren't used to. But I think that the credit mechanisms that have been introduced since the crisis began have been conspicuously less successful, and I'd be very interested to hear if anyone has any experience. John, you've got your hand up again. John, do you want to respond to that particular point?
I'll be super quick. Just two things to say. First is, as a small business owner, the loan scheme just felt like an absolute poison chalice, really, because there's no certainty to come at all. So even with any interest rate whatsoever, you'd be taking on something that you just couldn't feel any confidence in dealing with. And then the second thing I wanted to just chip in.
Sorry, John. Did you manage to get a loan through the scheme, or?
No. We decided against. We looked at it, looked into the details, but like I say, the option of anything that would have an interest rate attached is just and potentially a scaling interest rate. Just a loan is what you need in a situation where you've got no certainty whatsoever. So as a small business, I can't see that happening. The other point I wanted to make is a slightly broader one, which is, and just might be a thing I sniffed out the other day that you might want to have a look into a bit more, but which is about the banks that were administering these loans and how slow they've been to actually get stuff out. And I came across some interesting work about the idea of about regional mutual banking, and I know in the southwest and west of England there's been moved, and in London as well as London Bank, I think, that community owned much
there, John, a bit.
Much better able.
Yeah, I'm afraid you. Freezing there. Okay, sorry about that, John. We had some Wi-Fi problems there. Can we go to Chris Chadwick, who I think had his hand up? Chris.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm in the car, but just very quickly.
Another new background.
Yeah, I have an observation about a charity which I would prefer not to name, but they've taken advantage of the government's furlough situation, but actually their giving is voluntary, and there's been an outpouring of huge giving to them. And of course, there is a moral question there around whether taking money from the state in order to keep the thing going, even though their income effectively has massively increased. So it's not just about industry. It's also about all sectors.
Right. So, I mean, I take it from the fact that you're raising the point at all that you err on the side of not necessarily allowing them to participate in the scheme if in fact the revenues are sound.
Well, you know, I guess if you think of what's behind the spirit of the government approach is to try and help organisations that are struggling because their income has been decimated by the fact that they don't have any income. You know, they can't do any work. Then, you know, it would seem that if you've got good income coming in, irrespective of whether that's, you know, through earning money or people donating, it does seem a little bit of an issue for me. Okay. I just throw it out there as a slightly different slant on some of the discussions.
It's an under-discussed issue for sure. Coming to Dolly Samro, if we can.
Hi there.
Hi Dolly, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. I just want to say, yes, my husband did take advantage of both the grant and the loan, paid out within days. It was very easy, very prompt. I do know that there's a lot of self-employed people who are not getting these loans, but there's an element of question of the self-employment should, but there's some companies who just haven't received these easy to come loans, and you've got to question why, right? So if everything's in place and the government have put it in place adequately, if it's as easy as for everyone else, what's the problem for them?
Well, I suppose those who've had problems would say, and this is obviously secondhand, that the bureaucracy involved in getting the loans has been tremendously prohibitive. Clearly, that wasn't your experience.
No, and I think so. You have to question that, and also on James's point, you know, this isn't something that we, as the public or the government, ever contemplated going through. So there's an element of empathy needed when all these decisions are being made, because people are so quick to jump on the bandwagon and saying this isn't clear, that isn't clear. I'm sure that every decision that's been made, you know, time is required to fine tune it and get all the information together. I realise they should have that ready to start with, but I'm just saying that, you know, the government is probably as confused as, you know, an element of common sense prevails, right? When people are going out and whether they go to the garden or whether they go to the park. I would just think people could be a bit more sensible themselves. We're in it all together. You know, Boris went through he went through the illness himself, so he's got it firsthand. What's all this blame culture? I just think that we could be a bit more patient. And
interesting point. I mean, do you think there is a kind of slightly snide and impatient, probably social media driven culture that responds instantly and without thought to any sort of announcement of this sort?
Absolutely, and we're going through the worst time of our lives, you know, and all people are doing is focusing on who to blame rather than we're in it together. We all know what to do. We all have an element of responsibility to play in this. Do we need to say Boris says jump and then we move and wait for what Boris says? Can we not just do it right ourselves?
Dolly, thank you very much. I'd like to come to Alison, who's been making some very interesting points in the chat. Alison, if you're willing to join in, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Alison.
Sorry, I'm trying to get the video up, but I've got a bit confused here. Here we go.
There we go. There you are. Nice to see you. So you've been making some very interesting points about the way in which people have been using the furlough scheme and so forth.
Well, it's just that up here in the northeast, right, I've banged on about this before, actually on Tortoise, things are pretty difficult. We have some big institutions like the Sage Gateshead, our regional music centre. I'm sure its staff are on furlough, but it's also got an appeal going. And that applies to small organisations as well, because it's not just, you know, paying staff. It's like my son-in-law who's got a business, God help him, in Spain as it happens. He's losing money because of all the other extra things that still have to come out. So I don't think one should really be looking particularly carefully at charities at the moment. They're all just trying to scrabble to survive.
But what's your general view of the way in which in terms of the way it's landing on the ground, that this huge, I mean, the kind of massive scheme that and expansion, perhaps not necessarily reflecting a very clear navigation system that James alluded to. How do you think it's landing in your experience? Is it landing well, or with any efficiency?
I don't know. I'm only gazing from the outside. I think a lot about these things without actually being involved now. I'm retired. I'm just dead interested in it all, and I support a lot of arts organisations. So I'm viewing it from the outside, really, that particular perspective. So I can't see a way out of this any more than any of the rest of us can. But I was really interested in this whole idea that at the end of the day, the government wants to save itself more than do anything else, quite frankly. Anyway,
that's very interesting. Can I come to Gutesh Sandhu, who's made I think an important point. Hi, Gutesh, about the care home situation, which is all too easily lost sight of in all of this. Can you elaborate on what you were saying in the chat?
I think, well, there was one thing that I was saying, which is about the politics of Starmer's front page on the Telegraph.
Yeah.
On VE Day, which obviously for all of us is a political move, and the fact that the Telegraph reciprocated was really interesting. But then it was the focus on in that headline about that the same generation that we're now celebrating in relation to what they did during the war is the same generation that's dying in care homes, and I think that's going to be huge. And I actually think there was a comment made earlier about blame game and we shouldn't be sort of engaging in this. I absolutely think that in relation to care homes, it needed to be much, much harder, much, much earlier in relation to pulling up the government on it in a real aggressive time. Because I think as a consequence of not doing that at the right time, we've probably lost thousands and thousands of people, real lives. So so one is the politics in relation to Starmer, but secondly, I don't think the care homes thing for the Tory party, which has been reliant on this older generation in terms of its vote, where its vote comes from, is going away anytime soon. And it's really interesting, there's a YouGov poll that I was just having a look at just before we came on, that started where Starmer's starting to raise above Boris Johnson in terms of the ratings, and then when it gets broken down into different age categories and various bits and pieces, certainly you're seeing much more positivity in the 65 pluses, in the 45-55 and that group. And even the Leave, he's viewed 10% more positively amongst Leave voters than he was in the last poll. He's viewed 25% more positively with the Remain voters. So it feels like something's occurring, and I think the care home thing is going to be huge, as big as, you know, from a political perspective, as big as anything that's going to happen in the economy.
And do you think that it's, to a certain extent, it's premature to start to emerge from lockdown until we've resolved these issues, or can they be done concurrently? Can we have, on the one hand, a kind of very nuanced, phased emergence from lockdown, while on the other hand, we are trying to resolve these, severe hotspot-based problems in the care sector and elsewhere?
I think I agree with James. I just think it's much more complex than that. That there's going to have to be some level of balance. But specifically on care homes, because I think the politics of it is so significant. I think if I was looking purely at the politics of it rather than the economics of it, or even looking at the societal element of it, I'd say that Johnson cannot really ease up too much while we're still seeing that occurring in care homes and people are dying by themselves. and frankly speaking, the Nightingale hospitals are empty and people were shifted from there into the care homes. There are options that haven't been taken. And I think, so to your point, I think it's complex, but the care homes may stand in their own in terms of something that has to be resolved.
Thanks for that. Can we go back to James, who I think is...
Yeah, sorry, Matt. I just wanted to pick up on Gurtej's point, which is actually just an ask really of everyone on the call. We've been working for some weeks, Gurtej, on a piece on care homes, sort of a tortoise file. Let's have a deep, proper look. This is obviously not just a UK issue. It's, you know, it's an international one too, and it's really is one of those scandals in plain sight. But it's complicated. It's got different elements to it. So anyone on the, you know, in our open news meeting today, if you want to feed in on what we're doing on care homes, the editor on that particular project is Basha Cummings, and her email is Basha, BASIA @tortoisemedia.com. And so if you've got, because what we're trying to do is work out how do we pull together the individual stories, not just around COVID, but around care homes particularly, and then try and get to something that's systemic. So is that about ownership? Is that about oversight? We're trying to get at all of those things. So as you'll see, we're going to have a ThinkIn specifically on care homes on care homes and social care and the future of it next week, I think it is, next Monday night. But anyone who wants to feed in now, please do. That'd be really helpful.
Brilliant, thanks, James. And Ellie's put the, just in case you missed it, the email for Basha in the chat. So do please come in on that, because it's a hugely important project for us. I see Gurtej has his hand up, but I think that's from last time, or is that a new one? Did you want to come back? Gurtej, did you want to come back? Yes. So go ahead, Gurtej.
It was just an add-on, which I mean, it's particularly in relation to CAM. So I'm in a position with my wife where my mother-in-law has cancer and was being treated for chemo. And then about a month ago, she was told it had progressed aggressively and therefore she's in palliative care. We don't know. We don't know if it's weeks, we don't know if it's months, and yeah, they've been brilliant. One of the angles that I think is really interesting, you know, maybe from my own experiences, is what's happening with those people, because you know, we've moved her to our home now, but she can't see her grandchildren, she can't see a relative.
Yeah, we're losing you, Gurtej, I think,
Can't see,
which is extremely sad, because well, thinking of you, Gurtej. Sorry, we missed it. We missed a bit of that, but thinking of you and very sorry for that awful situation. Anyone who would like to chip in on any of those points in the last couple of minutes before I wrap up, because we've covered a great deal of ground. I think today is going to be dominated by Sunak's announcement, but there are a lot of other things going on. Martin Ricks points out in the chat that Gurtej mentioned the Nightingale Hospital, and indeed the latest Slow News podcast is on that, and I can only recommend it to you. It's a very, very good listen and exploration, reporting on what has happened in that regard. Alison, can we come to you? Come to you again. You have your hand up, I see. Hi.
I've been bashing on a bit also about local government. I do think that you know, the government agenda obviously has been to downplay local government for years now, and it has such a big role to play in this whole crisis, and there's very little about it anywhere. And I just think that's another topic that maybe is really timely to follow up on.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been exploring the sort of necessity of localism and also its interaction with economic regeneration and hopefully.
Yeah. I just say I mentioned this Professor Alison Pollock. She does people. It's kind of social sciences, I think. Heard her a couple of times on BBC, just talking about the infrastructures that are still there within local government that could have been used and aren't being used. And I'd like to know what the agenda, you know, how far can we push the government on why it's not actually doing more partnerships?
Well, I think the truth of the matter is that all governments promise localism and very few deliver. Just before we end, can we come to Keith Dunstan, who I think, hi Keith, how are you?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I just think you should consider that the OECD doesn't see care homes as providing social care. It comes under their definition of healthcare, and it is healthcare. And yet we have this artificial separation for economic reasons. And we run it completely differently and have different standards and different arrangements. And I think that's the underlying problem behind the trouble that we're in at the moment with nursing homes.
Yes, and the ironic thing is the only thing that has been unified is the rhetoric and the Whitehall organisation. So Matt Hancock is notionally responsible for both sectors and insists constantly that they have parity of esteem, but clearly they don't. And the social care sector is, you know, utterly decentralised, owned by goodness knows whom, and run in a totally different way to the health service, which is not to say that it should be run exactly in the way that Nye Bevan designed the NHS, but clearly to compare the two and say that they are the same simply because they're run or notionally monitored by the same Whitehall department is nonsense. I think, unfortunately, time marching on, so I'm going to have to wrap up. And as ever in these sessions, there's a embarras de richesse, really. There's so much good stuff and so much for us to go away and think about. I mean, I kind of divide it into three sections in trying to summarize all the things we've heard. I mean, I think there's a very interesting range of opinions on what the government has said in the last few days about the relaxation of lockdown, which suggests a considerable degree of skepticism, to put it mildly. And that ranges from Sue saying that, you know, we basically need to maintain a prescriptive regime, to John's very interesting description of citizen solutions and a kind of plea for opening up of the way, the mentality in which this whole crisis is approached to decentralized technology-based solutions that take in transparency and allow in the flexibilities that come with localized solutions. Also very interested in Martin's point about the deliberate ambiguity baked into the government's new approach and what that might tell us about the way in which they are planning to ease their way out of the crisis. And then I think we move on to the economy, not as a separate issue, but as a intimately entangled issue. And it's clear that we're really in the foothills both of understanding this and of really grasping what it is that is going on. So health dominated has the coverage, I suppose, inevitably been in the first few weeks, that it's all too easy to lose sight of the fact that we are, almost without knowing it, preparing a kind of a landscape into which we should all step of unknown economic difficulty. And Helena talked about, I think absolutely correctly, about the need to look at these things strategically. And as James said, the problem here, in a sense, is that we have a government that is used to running Android software, being asked suddenly to use Apple software, and forced to do so, but not necessarily very good at it. And the greater problem is that we don't actually know a lot about what's going on inside the black box of the Treasury. Always a fairly secretive institution, but at the moment pretty much impermeable. I mean, Sunak's appearance today in the Commons was the exception that proves the rule. He's been very absent from the public stage, which I think is something that we're going to have to correct. A massive moment in the history of British statecraft today, in the sense that the government promised to carry on employing possibly between 6.3 and perhaps 8 million people up until October, which by any stretch of the imagination and in any previous setting would have been mind-bendingly amazing. And it's very important, I think, not to allow ourselves to become habituated to these things, and to constantly remind ourselves that they are as extraordinary and that, as they are, and that they require deep interrogation rather than social media driven yes, no, on-off acceptance or rejection. So my takeaway is that it's been a few days of very, very hectic and headline driven and emotive response, and that has only proved, to me at any rate, the need for calm and strategic and careful analysis of the underlying forces. And I'm extremely grateful to all of you for helping us with that. Do look at the news list in the app. It's a very important kind of template of some of the things that we're looking at and the things that we'd like your help in investigating. And if you haven't signed up to the Daily Sense Maker, please do so. It's for me at any rate, I find it an absolutely invaluable a guide to the daily mysteries of this extraordinary experience we're all going through. Do join us again next week and at all the think-ins that we're doing during the week and beyond. And have yourself a lovely rest of the day, and let's all wave goodbye to each other. Thank you very much for coming.